Hello, welcome to Claigan's webinar on the upcoming restricted materials deadlines. My name is Bruce Calder. I'm the VP Consulting Services here at Claigan. Okay, so it's going to be super busy. For an hour webinar, or supposedly 50 minutes with 10 minutes of Q&A, this is going to be a lot of material. This is very much going to be we're the ostrich being chased by the cheetah. So that's why there's the funny little emoji down at the bottom. It's supposed to be 50 minutes, and this morning is pretty close to that. But to do that, I'm going to go really fast. I speak quickly often to begin with, and this is going to be a particularly bad case of that. On the bright side, everybody registered will receive a copy of the slides, probably not by tomorrow. There's a lot of attendees, actually. And there will be a recording version available online. Unfortunately, you probably won't be able to slow down the recording, so you're going to get what you get. We're going to talk about a huge number of things. I'm going to talk a tiny little bit about us, and then talk about new Prop 65 substances that kick in this month. We're going to talk about the new RoHS 3, or really Directive 2015-863 on phthalates. We're going to talk about the very impactful June 2018 REACH SVHC update. It's probably the most impactful in terms of creating declarations of any SVHC update so far. We're going to talk about the EU Substance of Concern database kicking in at the end of 2020 or so. The REACH restriction on PFOA. We're going to talk a little about EU MDR, and then we're going to have a little overview in it around endocrine disruptors, around the current ones and the new ones coming, how they get there, and what materials and substances are going to be affected. A little bit about UAE and Gulf Cooperation Council, RoHS, tiny summary and Q&A. If you have any questions during, please feel free to submit it in the chat window, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. If I don't get to yours, please feel free to contact me afterwards. So again, this is going to be going at a pretty brisk clip. So my apologies. I better get a copy of the slides, and there will be a recording, but there's a lot of material, and I'm going to be probably moving a little fast. I apologize right now. Okay, so a lot of what we're talking about these are the upcoming regulatory deadlines. Until at least the middle of 2021, and probably new regulations will be invented in between, there's a lot of stuff going on. We're going to start with the new Prop 65 substances that kick in at the end of October, so basically momentarily. The phthalate addition to RoHS, middle of next year. We're going to talk about the entry into UAE RoHS and medical and monitoring control January next year. And then the addition of UAE RoHS for everyone else, the phthalates, starting next year. And the EU MDR at May of 2020 or so. We'll talk about the new restriction on PFOA kicking in the EU under REACH. So it's a restriction, not disclosure in July 2020. The European Chemical Agency's the EU Substance of Concern database, where you have to register your products and their substance of concern. And then we'll talk about the addition of phthalates in RoHS for medical and monitoring control. Plus, every 6 months or so, the SVHC updates. And we're going to talk about a particular one, the June one from this year, that was particularly impactful. A tiny bit about ourselves. We do a lot of this. Consulting, process development. What are your products? Where do you sell? What do you have to be compliant to? What's the best way to get there? How do you actually do it? Also do gap analysis and education and a huge variety of other things. We also have web meetings where we just sit down with your company and your stakeholders and explain over the past month or quarter what's changed in this space and how it affects your product or doesn't, and be very, very specific about your products and your materials and so on and so forth. And then we do a huge amount of product testing. We're arguably the highest volume restricted materials lab in North America. We test thousands of products a year. A lot of what we're going to talk about is actually from pretty concrete data. We do a huge range of things. You'll see more of this in the very last slide while I'm sitting around doing Q&A. You get to see this. These are pretty typical things we test for every week. We test for a lot more than this, actually. And if you get a request from a customer that doesn't make a lot of sense, they send you a restricted materials list in alphabetical order, which makes no sense at all. We can make sense of it and what you're actually supposed to be compliant to and how to do it. So one of our big differences is we focus on compliance. You're not doing this for fun. You're doing this because you have to be compliant with some regulation or another to sell into a different market, to a specific market space. And we focus on end deliverables. For this regulation, what is the end deliverable? How do we get to that end deliverable? And then anything that doesn't help get to that end deliverable, we cut out. We just look at the deliverable. I need to make this declaration. I need this technical file. I need this test report. What's the end deliverable? What's the best way to get there? And if something you want to do doesn't help you get there, then we normally recommend something else. First, we're going to talk about Prop 65. First, we have a little Prop 65 diversion. In August of 2018, so a single month, there are 353 prosecution notices. That's quite a bit. 257 were for phthalates, orthophthalates. These are things that make PVC and neoprene bend. And we're going to talk a lot more about phthalates, especially in the RoHS world in a few minutes. But 257 were phthalates. 49 of the remainder were lead. Half were lead and brass, and the other half were lead and food. Processed food goes through enough piece of equipment that eventually picks up lead or cadmium from the brass components or other components, usually brass components, and it gets into the processed food. So if you take a heavily processed food like baby formula or some of that effect, they generally pick up lead or cadmium in the machines. And there's a variety of other substances like acrylamide, diethylamine, and wood dust, but they don't really affect physical products. For physical products, which we really care about for this conversation, you're looking at all the prosecutions in August were for phthalates or lead. 257 of which were phthalates, things that make wire and PVC and neoprene and all that kind of stuff bend. There are other options in phthalates, but when in doubt and you haven't chosen other options, it's the orthophthalate families. So a little look at the phthalates is definitely the growing part of Prop 65. It's fairly dominating. Last month was particularly large. It's possible that before the August 30th deadline, they decided to sneak some more in case the rules changed a little bit. So it could explain the spike in August. But in general, it's been increasing. The phthalate prosecutions under Prop 65 have been increasing for years now. But what we're going to talk about today is two new substances that enter enforcement, either in the end of October or the start of November. Depends how you calculate the 1 year. Basically, when a substance joins Prop 65, it's not enforceable for a year. And at that point in time, it's enforceable retroactively for that full year. And there are two substances kicking in at the end of October, PFOA and MBT. So MBT, which will come up a couple times in this presentation, is tumor-captive benzothiazole. It's a carcinogen. It actually went up to be an EU REACH SVHC. It didn't make the SVHC list because it was being listed as a skin sensitizer, and there was a particular court case, and they couldn't justify that skin sensitizers were permanent or create long-term effects, which means it can't be equivalent of concern to cancer or similar things. So it didn't make it on the SVHC list, but it did make Prop 65. It's one of the main uses as an acceleration agent for vulcanizing rubber. It's part of the sulfur vulcanization process. There's a number of ways to vulcanize rubber. Most of them involve sulfur. There is peroxide and a few others. So we're looking at vulcanized rubber. They very commonly use 2-MBT. Natural rubber latex uses very high concentrations. When we test for MBT in NRL or natural rubber latex, we get 1 or 2% concentration, so fairly high. But it also can be used for vulcanizing neoprene, nitrile rubber. We see MBT every single week. This is a relatively common substance. Generally, neoprene and nitrile rubber, it's in the 600 or 700 ppm range, but it can be higher. It's a relatively common material. If you have vulcanized rubber, it's pretty darn common. Now, currently, because it's a new substance, it doesn't have a safe harbor limit, and it doesn't mean that it can't have it at all. Right now, we have to look at the no effect limit from the EPA, which is higher than DHP's no effect limit. Therefore, it would be reasonable that 2-MBT can use the de facto DHP limit of 1,000 ppm. So anything below 1,000 ppm is going to be fine. Probably even up to 10,000 ppm. It's got a much higher no effect limit than DHP. But if the settlements say DHP to 1,000 ppm is fine, then tumor-captive benzothiazole under 1,000 will be fine too. But it is relatively common, particularly in latex. Natural rubber latex has it very commonly at relatively high concentrations. It is not an abnormal material to see. We'll also see this material pop up again in one of the later regulations we talk about. PFOA is perfluorooctanoic acid. It is a potential building block or processing aid for fluoropolymers. It doesn't have to be used for fluoropolymer manufacture, but as about 5 years ago, it was used pretty well in everything. So fluoropolymers, things like PTFE, Teflon, FKM, Viton, FKKM, FEP, PVDF, all this F is fluorine. These are all fluorinated fluoropolymers. You can have Teflon without PFOA, and quite commonly does now, but it can also use PFOA. So you need basically PFOA-free Teflon or Prop 65 warning. PFOA will come up again in a little bit. There's no safe harbor limit for PFOA. It's a new substance. And based on its no effect limit for the EPA and also the European levels, it's expected to be very low. When it does get a safe harbor, it's going to be tiny. It basically can't be there. So you basically, in anything that's accessible, you have to be non-detect for PFOA or have a related warning. So polyfluorooctanoic acid is something, a building block that's commonly used in fluoropolymers. It doesn't mean Teflon has it, it just can. So those are the new Prop 65 substances. As I said before, we're going to be moving on at a pretty good clip. There's going to be a lot of detail here. Now, one of the most fundamental things of restricted materials compliance, the fundamental rules of restricted materials compliance, is the things you're most likely to be non-compliant for, the things you didn't know about. And that's a big basis of this presentation, where we're going to go through a lot of things, and you won't necessarily get a deep understanding of, well, anything, but at least know what you should be looking at, and at least have some of the words. So now we're going to talk about Directive 2015-863 on phthalates as a new part of RoHS. So this kicks in for regular products in July of 2019. For medical electronic devices and monitoring control devices, we're looking at 2021 to have a phthalate restriction. Now, what this is about, when RoHS was first created, RoHS was, well, an accident. It wasn't intended to exist. What happened is, a couple decades ago, the European Union countries are looking at all this waste electronics, fridges and TVs and stoves and cell phones. And back then, cell phones were quite a bit bigger. And they didn't want to landfill this electronics, but more importantly, they didn't want to pay for it. So they created the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive, which offloads the responsibility, i.e. cost, of the end-of-life electronics from the governments and users to the importers and manufacturers. When they did that, they did some trial recycling projects, and they realized they were horribly poisoning the recycling workers to 4 heavy metals and 2 brominated flame retardant families. And they couldn't implement this recycling legislation while introducing additional hazard to the recycling worker. So what they did is they added materials restrictions to WEEE. Now, WEEE is a minimum directive and governed by a different part of the treaty, the EU treaty, from CE marking and product-related compliance. So it wasn't working too well. So last minute, they pulled the materials restrictions out of WEEE, created the RoHS directive, said we're not sure it's going to all work out very well for medical devices and control devices, so we're not going to include them. And we're doing it in such a hurry, it's not part of CE marking. And so they did that, all wrapped up in 2002, and went into effect in 2006. Written into it was a notwithstanding clause saying, eventually, we're going to rewrite this and move it into CE marking and move medical devices and monitoring and control into scope, which they did. And that's RoHS 2 or RoHS recast, 2011-665 EU. And at that point in time, they brought it into CE marking, they brought in medical devices, but they also brought in a section where this is great and all fine and dandy, we have 6 substances now, but other substances may be a hazard to recycling workers. Again, RoHS is not around user or consumer safety. It's around recycling worker safety. What is the recycling worker to be poisoned with? So when they look at adding new substances and they prioritize the 4 low molecular weight orthophthalates, they're not just phthalates, they're really orthophthalates. Phthalates is a much larger family. Terephtalates are also phthalates. Polyester is a terephthalate. These are orthophthalates. The 4 low molecular weight ones, and what makes them special, which will come up later, is these phthalates are, when they're metabolized by your liver, end up having a phenol group exposed, which has negative reproductive effects on your body. And we're going to go into that a little bit more later. These substances, these 4 phthalates, are being found in higher dangerous concentrations in the recycling worker's bloodstream, in the air in the recycling facility, and in the land and water around the recycling facility. So since they posed a hazard to the recycling worker and their environs, they added them as restrictions. There's the ability to add more. So there's a number of other substances going through review right now, one of which is beryllium. Beryllium itself is not a big deal when embedded in beryllium copper or another application. But when it's ground up and airborne and inhaled beryllium is a carcinogen. And so a recycling worker, when they grind up a product and the beryllium gets airborne, that's a cancer risk. So it's quite possible that beryllium, because of this reason, may end up being an RoHS substance sometime in the next 5 to 8 years. It's in the consultation process right now. But back onto the present, they added phthalate restrictions, which kick in for most electronics July 21st, 2019, and could kick in for medical, IVD, and monitoring control July 21st, 2021. And this is a 1,000 ppm restriction at the material level. So you take a thick film resistor, which on your circuit board is about the size of a grain of salt. It has about 20 different layers. Each one of those layers has to meet this restriction. So this is the new one we're talking about. It's sometimes called RoHS 3. It's really Directive 2015-863. Again, why are the phthalates added? RoHS is not related to the safety of the user or worker, consumer. It's around the safety of the recycling worker and their environment. The phthalates were reclassified some years ago as Category 1B, known to cause in animals reproductive toxin. They generally reproductive toxin because they bring down the sperm count of adult males. And later on in this presentation, that will come up again. It was found in the bloodstream of the recycling worker and the dust in the facilities and the environment surrounding the facilities. So that justified restriction. That's how they got on. More substances will go through this, and if they're dangerous and found in dangerous levels in the recycling worker or their environment, they will also be restricted under RoHS, or very likely will be. Where are phthalates used? The orthophthalates are plasticizers. So you take PVC. The natural form of PVC is like your water piping or your east troughing or gutter. It's rigid. It doesn't bend. To make it bend, you have to add a plasticizer. The most common being the orthophthalate families, in particular low molecular weight families. Some of the higher molecular weight ones, like the DINP, which is probably the most common phthalate in hookup wire, is not an RoHS substance. It is a Prop 65, not RoHS. It doesn't, in general, metabolize into the same harmful chemical that DHP does. So what it does is the plasticizers get between the vinyl chloride strands. So PVC is polyvinyl chloride, and it gets between the vinyl chloride strands and pushes them farther apart. And if you force the vinyl chloride strands farther apart, their bonds of attraction become weak. This is like when you take two magnets and you put them right next to each other, and they're really hard to move. But if you take two magnets, you put them arm's length apart, you can usually move them very freely and have a lot of fluidity. This is the same thing. By pushing the vinyl chloride strands farther apart, it reduces their bonds of attraction, which allows them more fluidity or flexibility, which allows them to bend or be softer. This is the difference between your water piping and your power cable, which is quite flexible. Another good example of the difference is if you have an ID badge, which is closer to the material of your credit card, that's usually rigid PVC. Even though you can bend it, it really isn't soft, and it's actually just quite thin, rigid PVC. But if you have a badge holder, that's sort of transparent, soft material, that's flexible PVC. So it's really different softness as opposed to just flexibility. Principal high-risk materials are flexible PVC, neoprene, more specifically called polychloroprene, nitrile rubber, styrene butadiene rubber, or SBR rubber, some adhesives, but relatively rare, and toughened or rubberized ABS. If you take a plastic like ABS and you want to make it softer, or you can basically make it into a case for an iPad, so when you drop it, it doesn't break, they can add phthalates to ABS or similar materials, but they rarely do. You're really primarily looking for PVC, neoprene, nitrile rubber, and SBR. The concentrations, phthalates, orthophthalates don't do much below 1%. So they're usually well over 10,000 ppm, usually pretty high concentrations. Sometimes they'll be at lower levels because they're a contaminant of a different plasticizer. DHP will be a contaminant of totem because of esterized phthalic anhydride. But some of the other allowed orthophthalates like DPHP and some of the others can often have, if they're not careful, residual or 1,000 ppm levels of some of the lower molecular weight phthalates. It's not impossible. So in general, a phthalate is pretty useless below 10,000 ppm, and in a power cable, we often see it up in the 300,000 ppm range, 30% by weight, very, very high. But sometimes it can be closer to 1,000 when it's a contaminant of the main plasticizer. So what are we looking at high-risk materials? Wires and cables, strain relief. So probably the single highest risk material, especially if you just buy the cheap version you throw in with your product, is an external power supply. Because its connector to the wall is a PVC connector with a flexible strain relief. The first cable coming off that connector, usually the outer jacket's flexible PVC. Then you have the brick, and inside the brick you'll have a handful of hookup wires, which are also flexible PVC. Going into the brick will be a strain relief of one type. Going out of the brick will often be a different strain relief, again a different PVC, which will use a different cable than it had coming in, and its outer jacket will be plasticized PVC, and then it'll have a connector on the other end with a strain relief, which is plasticized PVC. So a power brick can have 5 or 6 or more different flexible PVCs on the same product, which creates a lot of opportunity for restricted phthalates. O-rings, gaskets, neoprene O-rings, PVC, nitrile rubber, sealed radial bearings. If you have a shielded radial bearing, so use a metal shield, you're fine. But if you have a sealed radial bearing, the seal is normally nitrile rubber, which will normally be plasticized. A motor belt, like a fan belt, it's usually neoprene PVC blend. PVC stickers. A lot of companies use a lot of polyester stickers, but the PVC ones are not uncommon, especially on high durability stickers. We see them all the time. And if you look at your product and 6 or 8 different stickers on it, what are the chances and one of them is not PVC. Or then you look at your power supply and it's got a PVC sticker on it or a PVC flag. PVC stickers are pretty common. Soft rubber components, like sometimes we have little rubber feet on the bottom of a system. Synthetic leather is usually vinyl. And then soft covers. If you have a cover for your product, a vinyl cover or vinyl window, that's flexible PVC again. So this stuff is all over the place. It's often in very inexpensive materials, where a lot of more valuable products run afoul is they have a well-controlled product, and then somebody throws a $1 USB cable into the box, and all the different strain release and PVC on that are all phthalated. Primary challenges to the new RoHS. First of all, the data is not readily available. I mean, what you're used to in RoHS does not exist for the new RoHS 3. This phthalate, the data is not available on distributor websites nearly as much. The suppliers do not have the data as much. It's just not available. It's also not that reliable. We find that the certificates of compliance for phthalates are not very consistent. There's the high-risk materials with their actual chemicals inside. It's much harder to test for than, say, lead. There's a lot of mistakes. And we'll talk about that a bit more. Also, the ask is not clear. Is this RoHS 3? Is it RoHS 10? Is it RoHS with phthalates? The real name is really RoHS compliant, including Directive 2015-863 on phthalates, which just rolls off the tongue. It makes it really hard. It's really funny. Some people get very, almost like a religious battle about this, which doesn't make a lot of sense. We've had, when we use the word RoHS 3, even on the webinar, we'd have people email us that this is fake news. No word of a lie, that the use of RoHS 3 is fake news. Again, the ask is not clear. This is a particular challenge here. And if it's not clear for people who speak English or a European language, this gets extra exciting in Asia. So the ask is not clear does make the data gathering. Somebody says, well, is RoHS compliant, including Directive 2015-863? They say, well, it's RoHS compliant. There are semantics difference. This will often involve product redesign. A material that has it will need to replace the material. And the phthalates can be replaced, and there are a lot of replacements for it. But believe it or not, they're not actually the same. Even if you achieve the same durometer, it usually takes more flame retardant, and other properties have changed. And we find the controls are not in place to maintain compliance. We find the prototypes don't have phthalates, but the more common or the production runs do. A per part purchasing price is very much affected by that. A lot of companies have to reduce controls, and especially phthalates often appear in cheaper materials. They appear. Is data gathering very successful for RoHS? Oh, goodness, no. Not just gathering data, it's just not usually that effective. Data gathering after the fact in general is not very effective. RoHS probably put us in some bad habits where it became more the norm. In 2017, we tested thousands of products. About 60% of the finished electronic products that use data gathering as their compliance method failed RoHS 2 testing. Straightforward lead, mercury, hexavalent chromium, so on and so forth. And what it ends up being is probably about, based on last calculation, about a 1% supplier error rate on RoHS, which is pretty good. 99% quality rate is usually pretty decent, but if your product has more than 100 parts, chances are you're not compliant. And when we get to really complicated IVD devices, et cetera, which have thousands of parts, this percentage really means you're going to be non-compliant most of the time. And the initial results for RoHS 3 or the phthalates part is far, far worse. The failure rate is probably closer to 10% on high-risk parts. It's not a well-controlled material set. Data gathering has not been terribly successful, and people use full material declaration. I'll come up a bit later. It's a horrible, horrible idea. More effective approach is creating a restricted material specification and making it part of the design, not after the fact data gathering. So when you buy a standoff inside your product, you don't buy a standoff and then measure it afterwards to find out if it's 10 centimeters. You buy a 10 centimeter standoff, and then potentially measure the first one to make sure it's the right size. You don't buy an enclosure and then ask afterwards whether it's aluminum. You design and buy an aluminum enclosure. And then potentially, if you're really concerned, test the first first article. This is a part of design. It's a property the product has, and it has to be part of the specification. So we're a big fan of having a material specification you can reference in drawings, in your own specifications, in purchasing, and you can update separately as the regulations change and make it part of the design, as opposed to asking out of the fact, does it have this in it? Where you never asked for when it was purchased or made, and guess what? Whatever they tell you, if they didn't ask for it originally, it probably wasn't there in what they asked for in their design to their suppliers. So you get what you get. You don't get upset. what most companies do is create a material spec and then testing representative products to ensure their process is working. Our suppliers confirm they're following our material spec. We test the representative product. It passed. Therefore, our process is working. And we deal with enforcement, particularly in RoHS, with the national authorities, which we've been involved in 20 or 30 enforcement actions. They always ask for a test report. It doesn't mean you can't get by with a tech file if you can provide a tech file, but it's a lot of conversation. The test report is what they're looking for. And if you have a test report, even if your suppliers have made a mistake, in every case we've been involved in, they allow you to make the necessary corrections, saying you've done the right thing, just don't ship anymore until you fix it. Or basically they wish to accept whatever your proposal is. The test report is very important because your supply chain is going to make mistakes. We've talked about it a minute ago. The error rate, the quality rate is pretty good for RoHS, like 99%, and 90% or so for the new phthalate restrictions. But over the number of parts in your product, guess what? You're going to be non-compliant all the bloody time. You need a more effective plan. One of the other things that's come along is testing for phthalates. Specific orthophthalates is a pain because you have to digest them and use GCMS. It's more involved and costly. One of the new methods that's really appeared recently, and we use all the time, is FTIR screening, where the orthophthalates, the structure attached to the benzene ring, has a very specific peak in the FTR. You can't tell which orthophthalate it is, but you can tell you have an orthophthalate. And that creates an incredible ability to screen quickly in a minute or two instead of days of digestion GCMS testing and expense. And we test a lot of products using this as screening, but we also go to people's facilities and test their products or inventory or work cells to quickly screen through for which ones can't have or don't have orthophthalates, and they should not be concerned about. It's a very fast way to expedite. A lot cheaper and faster than GCMS. And if you're doing Prop 65, virtually every orthophthalate's in the Prop 65 list. DPHP is not yet, which is a synonym of DIDP, but virtually every other orthophthalate is. So if you have an orthophthalate, you have a Prop 65 risk 9 out of 10 times. So again, I don't want to go into so much depth here. A lot of what we're focused on is one of the primary rules of restricted materials compliance. The things you're most likely to be non-compliant for, the things you didn't know about. And I apologize for people. We have people attending from all over the world, which is really amazing and wonderful. And I apologize for the ones who are keeping up. They aren't English first language. And I really apologize for the speed. You will get copies of the slide. Also, I apologize for some of my word slurring and Canadian accent. My primary schooling was in French, so there's a lot of outcomes from that. Regulatory deadlines. One of the things we're going to look at right now amongst all this stuff is the REACH SVHC updates every 6 months. And everybody always, creates fear. There's an update, it changes every 6 months. Well, a lot of times it's not really a big deal. This one was a big deal. The June one this year was quite impactful. It's probably the most impactful, including declaration. It's not a restriction. Again, it's a disclosure. It's a communication to the recipients or customers. It's probably the most impactful of all time, even more than the first one, even more than the original phthalate ones. It brought in lead metal, which we'll talk about, and the cyclosiloxanes, which are ridiculously common. Virtually every product will need an update. There might be a few simple ones that don't need to now declare SVHCs, but a lot of companies say, hey, we've never had to declare SVHCs before. Well, you probably have had them, you just didn't know, but these ones are actually super common. One being lead metal, more specifically called powder and massive. It has to do with the naming classification of lead. So leaded glass, what's in a thick film resistor, is leaded glass. It's not lead, and therefore, and neither is it lead oxide. So it's not a declarable SVHC. So lead in glass is not a declarable SVHC. That's leaded glass and a different EC or different CAS number. Lead metals, lead in alloys, lead in brass, aluminum, steel, or high temp solder are declarable. So if you're using a lead exemption for RoHS for brass, aluminum, steel, or high temp solder, guess what? You have a declarable SVHC. It's not banned. It's not restricted. You just have to tell people you suddenly have lead. Now, a lot of companies put words around it saying, we're still compliant with RoHS, we're compliant with EU food contacting regulations in food products, or so on and so forth. But you'll have to declare lead in a lot of products. A simple example is not only high temp solder, but also your brass standoffs that are holding up your circuit board. To machine the inside of those screws, you need leaded brass most of the time because otherwise it's too brittle and you couldn't machine inside the standoff. So very, very common. A lot of people are declaring lead. What they don't, most people realize, is how common these are. Now, I've told a number of companies beforehand we worked with, it's just a trace component. It's not really supposed to be there. These are building blocks. These cyclosiloxanes are building blocks of silicone rubber and only trace. They're really in sunblock and moisturizer and deodorants. Well, guess what? They've never been regulated before. Day after comes out, a lot of data comes out. Oh yeah, it's everywhere. So most siloxanes, which you know as silicone rubber, or also dimethicone. Dimethicone is the code name for silicone rubber. So if you have a moisturizer that says dimethicone, that's silicone rubber. That is a ground up version of your spatula from your kitchen is inside your moisturizer. Now, one of the things about this, they are very bioaccumulant. They have a bioconcentration factor, the D4, D5, and D6 cyclosiloxanes have over 2,000 bioconcentration factor, which is the limit to be very persistent, very bioaccumulant. And what that means is inside fish, they accumulate to over 2,000 times the concentration in the fish tissue than are in the water. It's basically the fish act as big filters and can't process and eventually build up to the point they're dangerous. And it's not unexpected. If you take your kitchen spatula and grind it up and feed it to your pet fish, he may have a wee little bit of trouble metabolizing it. That's what this is. And moisturizer being a big cause this. You actually will see dodecamethylcyclohexasiloxane right in your moisturizer, sometimes D6. But you also see dimethicone, which is silicone rubber. It's a kind of name brandy kind of approach to say silicone rubber. I'm putting silicone rubber in your moisturizer. That's why you have the nice glossy finish. You just put a layer of your spatula all over your face. It doesn't sound very appetizing, but very common. But it's in silicone rubber. So the SDS down below actually say, actually, you know what? It's actually in the silicone rubber around 1%, 10,000 ppm. It's still there, the D4. And it's a bioaccumulant, and it accumulates. And then there's a bunch of test data that came out, especially for Japan, and say, hey, look, we tested 23 different silicone rubber products, and they all had it over 0.1% by weight. And they could be as high as D17, which is not regulated, but a lot of them are D4, D5, and D6, D6 being the most common. Dodecahexacyclohexasiloxane. Siloxane is silicone rubber. Also dimethicone is silicone rubber, PMDS. D6 is very common. They tested it. They saw it in everything. It's super common. If you have silicone rubber in your product, chances are you have a declarable D4, D5, or D6, or all the above. It's not banned. You just will have to declare it. A lot of consumers won't know what this is. It's actually written in the ingredients list in their moisturizer, and they're not scared of that. So, and they call it dimethicone instead of silicone rubber, so it sounds more appetizing in the ingredients list, but it's been in moisturizers forever. If you go home, get your shampoo out or your moisturizer, just flip around and find dimethicone. That's silicone rubber. It's basically you've taken the material that's in your spatula and just rubbed it all over yourself, which is fine. It doesn't hurt you, but it does, well, directly, but it goes into the environment, and eventually most organisms, especially fish, can't process it. They'll build it up, and if you eat fish, which I don't, and unfortunately don't like the flavor, but it'll build up in your body too. So those are the new sets. So 4 of them are going to be very, very common declarables for each SVHCs. However, these ones have never been controlled before. Because they're persistent organic pollutants, they're very persistent, very bioaccumulant. In general, they haven't been regulated on some things to regulate reproductive toxins or carcinogens. This is a newer category. 2 different categories of persistent organic pollutants. There's the flame retardants that a good flame retardant plastic likes oils and doesn't burn, so it likes fat and doesn't oxidize, so bodies have trouble processing. This is the other group. These are the silicones, which can build up. Your body can filter them, and your body doesn't metabolize silicone. I mean, silicone's one of the reasons you use it in a spatula in the kitchen. It doesn't dissolve in your food. It doesn't dissolve in acid or fats, and therefore bodies have a lot of trouble processing it. EU Substance of Concern database. Now, I did have this little warning up front that I might be going a little bit fast, and I apologize, and I'm trying to enunciate. But then again, I was educated in French. Unfortunately, I speak French, even worse than I speak English, which is kind of wasting my education, I think. But there we are. I'm going to go a little fast. Everybody who registered will receive a copy of the presentation. And also, I'm recording this right now. I hope my mother doesn't listen to it. She would hate my enunciation. She would tell me to speak slower. Sorry, Mom. Here we go. There's a lot of data. I'm going to try to keep it under 1 hour. I'm going to go through a lot of data. You can always get the recording downloaded from our website afterwards. You can play it back. I don't think you can slow it down. Again, my apologies. But here we go. The next we're going to talk about is the EU Substance of Concern database, which pops in 2020. When a lot of, for people doing restricted materials in your company, all I can say is incoming. There's a lot of stuff coming down the pipe. And this is what's on the table today. It's going to get worse. We're only looking out to 2021. It's going to get a lot worse. There are a lot more substances on path for RoHS. We'll show some stuff on the REACH SVHC process, and we're going to show you some wonderful stuff on endocrine disruptors and what's coming next. But this is the substance concern database, which is supposed to, all manufacturers are supposed to register their products and their substance of concern in the database by the end of 2020. Now, Europe, in its infinite wisdom, is really good at doing what they say they're going to do. It might take longer, it always takes longer, but they're usually good at doing what they say they're going to do. So this database is going to happen, just it may not be in time. But I can't say when it's going to be late until it's late. So the EU amended Article 9 of the EU Waste Directive, saying, hey, the waste providers should have more information on what's in products. So inside this new law, there's a requirement for the European Chemical Agency to create a database by the end of 2019, which should be really exciting considering they don't really know what to put in it yet. And then manufacturers have to register products with substance of concern by the end of 2020. Now, end of 2018, end of 2020 is the hand-wavy text in the Waste Directive. But it is in the Waste Directive. It's now part of EU law. There's a whole bunch of, the announcements and legal text are really short on details, like whether substance of concern is more than REACH SVHCs. A lot of the press releases say, hey, there's a REACH SVHC database. Actually, no, it's a substance of concern database, which will include at least REACH SVHCs, but they're in discussions right now to include RoHS compliant, REACH restrictions, instructions for treatment facilities, which make a lot of sense actually, since you have to make the instructions for treatment facilities under Article 15, you might as well put it in the database for treatment facilities. When the deadlines are exactly, well, they said end of 2020, but that's not very defined. If you're going to put products in there, how do we do it? Is it by SKU? Is it by name, by families, by trade name? How do we actually do this? What data are we going to put in there? Is it SVHC? Is it concentrations? Is it going to be RoHS compliant? Yes, no, exemptions? What's going in? They're also going to have some allowance for how long you have before the REACH SVHC updates have to occur. So that's part of the consultation going on right now. Is it 6 months? Is it a year? So when new SVHC comes out, you have to update your declarations within a year. That's under discussion. How it's going to be enforced? One of the neat things about a database is they don't know when you haven't done an update, because you're in the system and haven't done an update. It's like most weed enforcement not comes from the fact you're not registered. Most weed enforcement comes from the fact you're registered and you forgot to report for a year. One of the things is, will the database require more than REACH? Likely, but we don't know for sure. There's a lot of consultations up. That's why the European Chemical Agency having the database up and running by the end of 2019 is optimistic, because they don't really have criteria yet or details. And then they have to tender the writing of it and then actually write it and troubleshoot it and then write guidance for it. It may be late. They're very capable individuals, but this might be tough. So provisional deadlines of the European Chemical Agency has to create a database by the end of 2019. Manufacturers have to register products with substance of concern by the end of 2020. Likely going to be late, but chances are it'll go into effect. There's even a small chance it might still be voluntary. It doesn't look like it. The law is not written that way, but it is a part of conversation. Chances are it's going to be mandatory, but voluntary might actually end up being the way it is. We don't know. There's so much we don't know about this, other than it's supposed to be the end of 2020, and you have to register your products with their substance of concern. Any detail around that is a bit vague at this point. By the way, if you have any questions, you can also put in the chat window, and I'll try to get to as many as possible at the end. If you have any other questions for me, also feel free to contact me afterwards. Going a bit quick, and I apologize. Back on to perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA. So PFOA is restricted under REACH. So REACH has the SVHCs, which is substance of very high concern, which are declarables, and you have to declare, but they're not banned. But they also have the restrictions, which are bans. It's a different part of the regulation. It's Article 67 versus Article 33. It's a big legislation. It's 900 pages, or about 10% longer in French. Anything written in French is much larger. You should see the serial boxes here. Anyways, PFOA is restricted under REACH. This is a restriction, not a disclosure. So, as of July 2020, articles imported to the EU for sale or manufactured in the EU for sale cannot have PFOA above 25 parts per billion. So it basically can't be there. PFOA is a building block that can be used, but there are many other options to make many fluoropolymers: Teflon, Viton, FKKM, FEP, PVDF. Until 5 years ago, PFOA was used in almost all of them. Now a lot of manufacturers have changed, but it depends where you get your fluorinated polymers. The deadline is July 2020. Articles placed on the market after, so imported into the EU after July 2020. Except for medical devices. They haven't until July 2032. I have no idea why. My kids can worry about this deadline. That's a little far out, even for medical devices. So regular products is restricted in 2020. Medical devices still have to comply with the Prop 65 warning part of PFOA, but not the actual restriction that's in Europe. So they're banned at 25 parts per billion PFOA. Now, there's a lot of people's conversations that PFOA-related substances include PFOS. There is a separate guidance or piece underneath it that says, no, PFOS is governed under POP at 1,000 ppm. It's not part of this. A lot of people don't have no idea what I just talked about. It's fine. This is PFOA. It's just PFOA, 25 parts per billion. Historically, it was used in Teflon, PTFE, FKM, Viton, and many other fluorinated polymers and waterproof coatings. Most waterproof coatings are fluoropolymers. Water just runs right off it. There's usually wires and coatings. So you have PTFE wires, PTFE coated wire. But there's a huge amount of Teflon coated pans. We get PTFE gaskets, tons of materials. But even on your integrated circuits, board components, many board components use PTFE gaskets as part of their encapsulant or enclosure. Those little chip guys on your board, little orange guys or black guys or whichever they are there, they often have a PTFE gasket, which is also restricted at. So since this is a REACH, it's at the article level, which is the component level. So PFOA is banned at 25 parts per billion at the component level, not the layer level, but the component level. EU MDR. So this is the European Union Medical Device Regulation, which I stuffed a lot of words into 5 little letters. This is May, sort of, 2020. The reason it's sort of, the people in the medical device industry generally understand this, where that's the deadline. However, if you have a valid MDD, Medical Device Directive certificate, in general, sorry, 2 seconds. If you have a valid MDD certificate, it's still valid to the end of the MDD certificate. And there are some end deadlines. It doesn't go on forever. So for legacy products, they can still go to their end of their MDD certificate before they have to cut over to MDR. But the actual, for anything else, it kicks in May 2020. So May 26, 2020. Now, legacy products I mentioned do have some ability to allow their MDD certificate to expire, but it doesn't go on forever. There's some additional end dates that aren't worth going into here, but you have additional time. The main ones we're going to talk about here in the MDR, which is a very extensive regulation, we're going to talk about the restricted substances part, which are really around 10.4 substances, 23.4S information instructions for use, and 6.2D additional information required in specific cases. I'm not going to address the third one too much. This is if you have some of the substances and you have to provide other information to the user or practitioner, you're required to do so. We're going to talk right now mostly about 10.4 substances, of which 10.4.1 is a very poorly worded section. They took 2 ideas under the design and manufacture of devices and squished them together. It didn't make a lot of sense. This wasn't like I made tiger tail ice cream, took licorice and orange ice cream, stuffed them together to make something. These don't really belong together. There's a section on debris product restriction. You can only have so much. You can't have dangerous debris coming off your product. For example, if you're a catheter and you're using a coating or Teflon or something like that, the Teflon can't peel off in little chunks and float down the arteries and clog things. That's what the first section is. It's around stuff that comes off and causes harm. The second section is totally unrelated. It's on substance justification requirements. So basically, if you have a device or material that are invasive or fluid contacting, or whether fluids going into the body or stored to go into the body, or gas contacting, the gases go into the body or stored to go into the body, if you have any certain substance, the following substances, about 0.1% by weight, you have to justify them. Not banned, there's a justification requirement. And the substance types are the category 1 CMRs, so carcinogens, mutagens, and reproductive toxins. Category 1 is known to cause. Category 2 is likely cause. This is only category 1 CMRs. Or it's an endocrine disruptor that is defined. So it's not an endocrine disruptor because it's, a scientific paper says it's an endocrine disruptor, or as the guidance document says, these are kind of like endocrine disruptors or likely endocrine disruptors. No, they have to be defined specifically through the REACH SVHC process or the EU biocides process. There are only 2 processes currently available that can classify a substance as an endocrine disruptor. the SVHC process or the biocides process. And if it has not been classified by one of these, it is not officially an endocrine disruptor. Now, one thing probably the medical associations will have to do is sort of figure out that once a new EDC is identified or classified, how long before it applies here. So if you're about to certify a device or submit for a device and a new endocrine disruptor is defined 1 day beforehand, that's not reasonable for you to have to try to figure that out. So there should be some kind of window, but that is not in the law. It hasn't been sorted out yet. If you do have 1 over 0.1% by weight in a material in that invasive fluid or gas contacting situation, you have to justify it, of which in their infinite wisdom, the justification guidance document for phthalates will come out a day before it's needed, which is a bit late. So currently, you really have to say what the danger is to the patient or the user, what are the alternatives, why we can't use the alternatives, and then use any guidance if available. In general, in the absence of guidance, you're looking at really 2 ways to justify. A, you can show that it doesn't actually get into the human body, that it doesn't come off the material or doesn't go inside. For example, you have some kind of a product that pushes gases into the product, or respiratory, and there's a solenoid in there, and the solenoid's got a brass plunger to open and close the air path, and the brass plunger is leaded brass, which is a category 1 CMR, and hopefully, so what you want to show in this point in time when you justify it is there is no lead that gets into the air path, which is perfectly reasonable in this case. If you can show no lead is in the air path, then there isn't much risk. So if there isn't anything getting into the body, you're not looking at any risk. Another example is you have a tube, you're putting water or sweat down it, the phthalates won't come out of it. However, you put milk or vegetable oil or some oily substance, the phthalates will come out very rapidly. So you want to show that the category 1 CMR, the endocrine disruptor, doesn't actually come out. Or you want to show that the alternatives are not feasible. Either they won't do the job or you can't get them qualified in the reasonable amount of time. Preferably, you show that none of it cuts into the body. That makes life a lot easier. And when you're looking at DHP components, etc., one of the biggest differences is whether or not it's touching water or acids, or whether or not it's touching oils. Oils will strip phthalates right out of the plastic. Now, what are the CMRs and endocrine disruptors? There's a list of category 1 CMRs. A lot of medical companies are going through some great challenges to try to sort that out. The European Union has one heck of a program going on to determine every single category 1 CMR and endocrine disruptor that's likely to be over 0.1% by weight in products. It's part of CORAP, and that's ends up being the REACH SVHC process. And any category 1 CMR that's expected to be a product over 0.1% by weight through this review process will end up on the SVHC list. Endocrine disruptor, except for antibacterial substances, are all going to come through the REACH SVHC. And if you don't have antibacterial coatings, they have to be REACH SVHCs. That's the only way they're going to become classified as an endocrine disruptor. So the REACH SVHC list is going to dominate. And if Europe doesn't believe they're above 0.1% by weight or present in products, then what is an individual company supposed to do? There are a few that aren't on the list yet. There's some technicalities. Some of the individual elements like mercury or beryllium aren't on there yet, but they're in the process of becoming REACH SVHCs. Virtually every single category 1 CMR and every endocrine disruptor that's not an antibacterial substance will be a REACH SVHC. Just a matter of time. So the European Union has a roadmap. This is part of CORAP. They have a view forward of what they're doing in terms of SVHC identification. They've looked at 1,699 substances, of which 51 they decide are intermediates or not likely to be present above 0.1% by weight. They've regulated 15% of it. 8% they say it's not going to be a problem, and are not in products above 0.1% by weight, are not worth regulating, and 25% are still in the process. So there's about 400 or so still in this review process. And whether they're CMRs, endocrine disruptors, or persistent bioaccumulants. Now, persistent bioaccumulants, very persistent, very bioaccumulant are not problems for the MDR. Bioaccumulation is not governed. It's only endocrine disruption in category 1 CMRs. Example on the endocrine disruption, though, look at the process. We'll take a look at Bisphenol-A, which was BPA, which was definitely the flag bearer in this whole process. It's the first one to go through everything. It was reclassified as toxic for reproduction and placed on the REACH SVHC list in January 2017. It's a category 1B reproductive toxin, 1B being known to cause in animals reproductive toxicity. In July 2017, it got classified as an endocrine disruptor in animals. It was one of the first endocrine disruptors classified. Now, it didn't affect the SVHC list at all, because if you had to list it as an SVHC. It didn't change whether you had to list it. It's still listed. And then in January 2018, it got updated again to endocrine disruptor in the environment. Again, this doesn't change the SVHC list, but it did act as reclassification as an endocrine disruptor. Now, BPA, and you look at the news, people focus on water bottles, and everybody talks about BPA. It's water bottles and inside of cans. Polycarbonate is made from bisphenol-A, but most polycarbonate is well under 100 ppm BPA, if not under 10. The main culprit is actually flexible PVC, which rears its ugly head in virtually everything. Flexible PVC, when it's extruded, oxidizes in air and needs an antioxidant, of which BPA is one of the historically most common. It's not as used as much nowadays. But if it's the antioxidant in the plasticizer package, it can be as high as 2,000 ppm. So if it's part of the antioxidant in the colorant, we usually see it about 10 ppm. If it's the antioxidant in the PVC, we see it around 100 or 200 ppm. And if it's the antioxidant in the plasticizer package, we see it upwards of 1,500 or 2,000 ppm. It's one of the few times it gets above 1,000 ppm. So it's when BPA is an antioxidant, it's when you're more likely to see the high concentrations. What are the endocrine disruptors? What is an endocrine disruptor? It disrupts the endocrine system. Okay, more specifically, currently I believe all the ReACH SVHC endocrine disruptors, so all the endocrine disruptors defined today are all estrogenic. They stimulate estrogen. They create a female response. And the way that works is estrogen doesn't make you more female. Estrogen, or estradiol more specifically, is a key to a lock. It unlocks the estrogen receptor. It tells the estrogen receptor to make you more female, and it makes you more female. So in a lot of ways, estrogen is a key to a lock. There are a number of chemicals that have a chemical structure that's similar enough to estrogen they can jimmy the lock. They're not nearly as effective. They're 100 or 1,000 times less effective, but they can kind of jimmy the lock and convince your body to be more female or estrogenic. So bisphenol-A, for example, is an estrogenic endocrine disruptor. The male outcomes, you make a young male more female. They get anxiety. It's not depression. They just get anxiety, which everybody else refers to as attention deficit, but it's just a form of anxiety. When they get older, an older male, if you make an older male more female, their sperm count goes down. An adult male, you make them more female, their sperm count goes down, which is pretty normal when you have a higher estrogen level. So it triggers the estrogen receptors and makes you male more female. Now, if you make a female more female, the outcomes are quite different. And one of the outcomes is precocious puberty, early onset puberty, primarily through hyperovarian growth. The ovaries grow too large and too fast. So when they do the tests on rats for endocrine disruptors, the estrogenic ones, they look at male sperm count, which is very measurable, and they look at the size of the ovaries. The ovaries, I can't remember the exact number, but something around 150% normal size if their ovaries grow too fast. One of the outcomes of ovaries growing too fast is they often get cysts, which is commonly called polycystic ovarian syndrome. So when you see a rise in attention deficit in males, you should expect to see a rise in ovarian cysts in females. They're a very similar response. And there are many, and so a lot of the estrogenic ones, if you look over on the right, in the middle is estradiol, one of the main estrogens. Its active region, the key to the lock, is the left side. It's the phenol group. The phenol group is that hexagon, that benzene with the OH, that alcohol group. That's basically a drunk benzene. Phenol is a drunk benzene. It's an OH on the little double bonded hexagon. That's the key. If you look at BPA above, it's a pretty clear similarity where its left side is also a phenol group. That's how it jimmies the lock. Nonylphenol phthalates, which you would have known as laundry detergent until 2005, when it's metabolized, it also becomes nonylphenol phthalates, becomes nonylphenol, and has a phenol group like you see there. And it's that phenol group that can jimmy the lock and kind of trick the body into having a female response, can jimmy the lock on the estrogen receptors. And there's most of the other endocrine disruptors that are currently classified are all estrogenic. The low molecular weight phthalates, which are covered under the new RoHS, are all estrogenic. And they're not estrogenic by themselves. It's after they're metabolized in the liver, they lose one of the ester arms and they get a group very similar to phenol. So DHP, which is diethyl hexylphthalate, becomes monoethyl hexylphthalate and has a phenol-like group which can jimmy the lock and creates a female response. And there's a number of coming in the future. One of the big ones is octisalate or octisalicate. Octisalate is the nice happy name for it. So when you get sunscreen in North America, benzophenone will often be the UV blocker, and octisalate is the dermal penetrator. It's what allows your sunscreen to be absorbed. So if you get sunscreen that you don't have to clean off afterwards, so zinc oxide you have to clean off because it won't penetrate your body, but you get the ones you don't have to clean off because it gets absorbed by your skin, that's octisalate. Octisalate's got a phenol group. It creates hyperovarian growth, low sperm count, It won't be classified probably for another year. It's in the CORAP process. In the meantime, I would not spread it over a large dermal area. It's a dermal penetrator. It's supposed to be absorbed by the skin. It's got a phenol group. It's kind of a bad idea. So that's a good example of one coming up. All the ones with phenol groups or after metabolism have a phenol group are likely to be restricted in some way, shape, or form. And there's a number of other similar ones in review right now because they're estrogenic. They make people more female. Well, we have a new group coming. Those estrogenic ones are all old news. Now we have the thyroid disruptors. And a lot of the estrogenic ones can also play havoc with the thyroid. Anything that affects female-male ratios can affect the thyroid. But we're talking about the thyroid disruptors, and they affect one of the enzymes in the thyroid and create hormone production imbalances. Even at low levels, some of them like ethylene thiourea, which happens to be a reach SVHC for other reasons, creates hypothyroid. Even at really low dosages, it creates hypothyroid. It's quite easy to do that. At medium dosage, it has the power to create fetal resorption, where you can take a viable fetus and reabsorb it into the tissue wall, which is fairly unpopular. And it's quite strongly linked to autism. Now, autism is hard to link to things because it's very separated in time from the event. But if they're correct, this could explain why autism is very sex selective, why it's male dominated. It looks like it is a thyroid imbalance that creates a sexual developmental flaw in the male child, which manifests later as autism. Like most things in autism, it's a little harder to prove one way or another because the separation in time is quite strong. But there's a lot of correlations and relationships to thyroid disruptors. At a very minimalistic level, they easily create hypothyroid, even at very low dosages. What are the suspected thyroid disruptor? What are the ones in CORAP or the European processes to become endocrine disruptors? Thyroid disruptors, ethylene thiourea, 2-MBT, which we talked about earlier under Prop 65, and 1,3-dihydro-4,5 methyl 2H benzimidazole 2-thiol. It does not have a nice, sexy short name yet. The first one actually being reviewed as a thyroid disruptor, endocrine disruptor, is 1,3-dihydro-4. If that one goes through, it'll probably open up the floodgates to the rest. What are the first group? Those are vulcanization aids. They're a big part of the sulfur vulcanization process and different options. Ethylene thiourea is also related to a pesticide, but we're looking at here for physical products is vulcanization aids. Usually as a vulcanization accelerator, vulcanized rubber, and part of the sulfur vulcanization process. Peroxide vulcanization uses a different material set. It's also, another one in the group is benzotriazole, which is an amine-based one. It's a polishing aid. So if you get those little dishwasher tabs and you get the little ball on the top that makes your silverware so clean, that's benzotriazole. That is a thyroid disruptor and shouldn't be in the water supply. For better or for worse, it's not restricted yet, especially in North America. But this is the family going through right now. They all have similarities. They're all these amine or nitrogen and often sulfur groups, which disrupt the thyroid. How they do that, I'm not quite clear, but they're all very similar materials that have effect on the thyroid. These are not restricted yet. Ethylene thiourea is an SVHC and a Prop 65. But they're not endocrine disruptors yet. If 1,3-dihydro is identified as an endocrine disruptor, it shouldn't be long for the rest are too, which in a practical term will start bringing in vulcanized rubber as being a material of concern. Like the problems we have with PVC today, we're looking at vulcanized rubber being a problem child because of these agents. So huge long page, lots of text, very exciting. If you have to justify a material, you have to label for it. So historically in an MDD, if you had DHP in a fluid or invasive situation, you had to label DHP. Now you have to label whatever the substance is on the device packaging, or where appropriate in sales packaging. So if it ends up being BPA or in the future 2-MBT, you have to label the product for it. You have to justify it as part of submission and then actually label for it. So there's a lot more detail around it. If you have to justify for Cat 1 CMR or for an endocrine disruptor, you're going to also have to label for it. There's a bunch of other details. If it's intended for the use of for treatment of children, pregnant and breastfeeding women, or treatment of other patients considering particularly vulnerable, which is a pretty open-ended situation, you're going to have to provide other precautionary measures if applicable. This is going to be really exciting for reproductive toxicants and endocrine disrupting chemicals. I'm trying to provide those warnings because they're not a really good plan for pregnant or breastfeeding women. Allergens, this is a much bigger topic. This deserves its own presentation all by itself. Under the new one, you have to provide precautions related to allergic reaction. What's an allergen? People go, well, nickel, latex. Yes. However, with the advent or the introduction of immunological adjuvants, the material set that forms allergies, which are relatively common out there, people are allergic to a lot more things than they used to be. And sometimes what they're allergic to is not what they think it is. People think they're allergic to gold. They're really allergic to the nickel underbarrier. People think they're allergic to silicone or allergic to the thiourea vulcanization agent. But from a regulatory point of view, if somebody has an allergic reaction, that's likely to have enforcement. It's much easier to enforce than buying a product and testing for lead. It's really easy to have somebody report an allergic reaction. So how do you ring fence your allergens? What is your allergen list? Does your association have one? I don't think so. So what we suggest is regulatory and legal sit down and work out how they're going to ring fence it. Is it going to be a list from the association? Is it going to be the negative reports we've had from customers? How do we define allergens so we can properly warn for them? In terms of how we do MDR, this again is a presentation on its own by far. We look at definitely taking the biocompatibility matrices and the extended versions. And often, a lot of companies use the same materials over and over again and process that list on which ones can have category 1 CMRs or endocrine disruptors. And if so, they could have it. What's the related test? So you can check it off. And we try to do in a tabular format the exact same way you do biocompatibility to make it integrate with your current technical file and processes. And then once you've done it at a corporate or business unit level, then you implement it at individual business user and products where they have to, based on this matrix, we know for materials, here is the test suite or the low risk suite for those materials. And then whether they test for it themselves or a supplier tests for or validates for it, it creates a very set piece table that you can complete the same way you complete biocompatibility. One more, I think UAE and the Gulf Cooperation Council have implemented RoHS. Now, the Gulf Cooperation Council is a pretty funny name because they don't cooperate whatsoever. Saudi Arabia has a variety of problems right now with its neighbors, but it was recently laying siege to Qatar, so it doesn't seem very cooperative to me. However, they're all implementing a standard RoHS. What UAE is implementing, they're all implementing. And the concept is, if a product's valid or compliant in one country, they want to be able to sell it in all of them. So they're creating a common RoHS criteria. So basically, if you're certified or registered in, say, UAE, you can sell in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc. Now, the main deadlines are the UAEs right now because they're the first ones to implement it in their own legislation. So as of January 1st, 2018, regular electronics, especially new ones that have to register for safety, have to provide an RoHS test report. Now, it also applies to legacy products, but the methodology system really isn't in place to register legacy products. But if you register a new electronic device for safety, you're going to have to provide an RoHS test report. For medical devices, after January 1st, 2020, when you register a new medical electronic device, you're going to have to submit a test report. Monitoring and control, it's anyone you submit for electrical safety after January 1st, 2020, you're going to have to provide a test report as part of registration. The phthalates kick in January 1st, 2020. So if you're registering a new, it should be legacy, but right now it's only new product for safety after January 1st, 2020, you're going to have to provide a test report, which includes the phthalate restrictions for Europe, and medical devices monitor and control after January 1st, 2022. So very, very soon after the European deadlines for medical devices. This is actually a test report requirement. The compliance standards are the same. They use the same test standards. They use EN 62321, but you have to register with the national authority and provide a test report. It could be of the full product or at least 3 critical components. Strangely enough, because it's often done by the same people as electrical safety, they think in critical components, which is a bit weird for RoHS, but they'll accept 3 critical components. Most companies just test for the full product, use that for risk mitigation for EU RoHS, and improve the process works and to really diminish the chance of enforcement, but it's mandatory when submitting for a UAE registration, and it will be for the rest of the Gulf Cooperation Council as their legislations come online. But if you register in one country, you don't have to re-register in all the others. That's the point. So again, Claigan, we do a lot of consulting and process development, like today. What are your products? Where do you sell? What do you have to be compliant to? And how do you do it in practice? We have update web meetings. We've been really high level here. What we often do for companies, very commonly we do about 30 companies a month right now, where we sit down with you, explain what's changed the past month or past quarter, and then how it impacts you, and have a dialogue. It's just you and us. We have a dialogue. It's very inexpensive because we do so much of this. Our knowledge base is very strong. And we go back and forth on how it actually really applies. And then we do a tremendous amount of product testing. We're arguably the highest volume restricted materials test lab in North America. We do thousands of products a year for a huge range of legislations. This is stuff we test for every week. We actually test for quite a few other things also. If a customer comes with some obscure requirement, we usually know what it is. Just talk to us. So I'm going to do a bit of Q&A, and I apologize again for the speed. If you have any questions, please feel free in the chat window, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. If I don't get to yours, please feel free to contact me afterwards. Again, apologize for the speed. One of the fundamental rules of restricted materials compliance is the things you're most likely to be non-compliant for, the things you didn't know about. So at least hopefully this presentation gave you some idea of the things you should be looking into or potentially looking into. And as they come up, you at least have a starting point to know what to look for. That was very brief. Everybody who registered will receive a copy of the slides. Probably due to the sheer volume of registrants, it won't be till tomorrow or later. And then soon we should have a recorded version of this up on our website you can download, and I wish you could slow it down, but that might not be true. So now I'm going to try to get to as many questions. Please feel free to put any in the chat window.